Way back in the olden days, like 2013 or so, I cared what people thought of the video games that I beat were. This was when I was like 19 and had zero redeeming personality traits. Now I don't care, so I have one redeeming quality. But the consequence of this was that I played the first Castlevania, and I enjoyed it. Not only that, but I played its sequels like Castlevania 3, Bloodlines, and obviously Rondo of Blood. These are all pretty cruel games that are ultimately fair, but they require you to know how to play around its deliberate design decisions. It's not like they forgot how to give characters full jumping control or the ability to whip in all directions. It's just that when they did that, the games lost some of the charm the earlier titles had, even if it did gain its own unique charm, which is why Castlevania 4, for example, is many people's favourite. And while I wholeheartedly enjoy many of the games in this style, my favourite is easily the one I'm going to ramble about, Dracula X Chronicles. Not to be confused with Dracula X, which this game is very different from. Chronicles is actually a remake of the at the time Japan exclusive Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine CD. For a long time, this was the elusive title that was limited to importers and fans of emulation, so it had a larger-than-life reputation among the hardcore, and it got a look of confusion from everyone else who had never heard of this elusive game. It wasn't until 2007 with this PSP remake that the game was ever localized and released internationally. And I don't just mean it was released in this 3D style. Dracula X Chronicles for PSP also includes the entire PC Engine version of the game fully translated and voice acted as a bonus. Some even say they only bought this remake just to play the old game buried inside it instead of this fancy polygonal one. Including the original, previously exclusive Japanese game as just a fun bonus is so damn good. It would be like if Trials of Mana included the localized 16-bit Super Famicom game, but hey, I don't mind buying games twice. I'm bad with money. And if that didn't prove it, look, I even own Banjo Pilot. In fact, while we're listing bonus features, instead of actually talking about the game itself, this doesn't just include one old game staple to it, it has two. The sequel, Symphony of the Night, is also included, though it wasn't given a full remake, and like I mentioned before, is more of just a fun bonus. Though the back of the box sure doesn't treat it like that. Some people hate the Symphony release because the voice acting was changed to be less iconic, but I don't care. Not because I'm attached to either edition of the voice lines, but because the exploratory Castlevania games are a beast I haven't tackled yet, and I'm sure as hell not starting that when I have two different versions of Rondo of Blood right here. But the package doesn't just stop at these great games. We also have P.E.K.K.A here. It's unlocked if you beat the normal boss rush 3 times. We can't forget about P.E.K.K.A. Though unfortunately all these old games have a mandatory background in place to fill the void left by the widescreen display. And while options do exist, I can't just keep it black. This is literally unplayable. But let's ignore the bonus games. What makes this remake in particular my favourite Castlevania? Now that I say that out loud, I do realise it seems kind of foolish. Like, how can the ugly 3D models compete against nice pixel art? Well, it's cause ugly 3D models are my jam. Inject those into my eyeballs. The PSP loved turning what were once beautiful 2D sprite-based games, and instead giving us dated 3D models. And I love it. I know this is entirely a subjective thing, but I don't care. The original pixel art was good, especially with some background and foreground elements that the new models can't match. But people are too hard on this ugly 3D, especially since it was made for such a small screen. When it's blown up in an emulator with high resolution, yeah, it becomes a sin, but the lack of fidelity is excused here with the intended resolution. Everything is jaggy for a reason. And while it's fun to have my defense of a new look be as charmingly ugly, there is much more to it than that. Some backgrounds are given much more detail and help sell this location, with all this depth in the distant backgrounds. And they've made sure to properly render these stages as being old relics that have begun crumbling apart, though admittedly it doesn't quite pop as much. We've traded in colourful landscapes of a standard mid-2000s muted look that games strived for if they wanted to be taken seriously. But this new look does lead to nice touches. Like this boss who does ice attacks now has a cold room with chunks of ice littering the background. Or how when we ride down this waterfall, It's actually way more chaotic and doesn't feel like an amusement park log ride. And the screen after that is prettier than it has any right to be. Frankly, it's hard to bolster the looks here because they're being compared to something that is almost universally more appealing. We all know high quality sprites look better than chunky 3D models for a mid-2000s handheld. But my attempt of a defense here is just that these look appealing to me and the other weird people who like this sort of thing. But if that's still not enough and you're really that bothered by 3D models, the original game is still included here. It's not like it was overridden and replaced. But if we do look at the Dracula X Chronicles version of the art style, and just don't compare it against anything else, it does still look pretty good. It's just that the competition was unfairly stacked against it. Plus, this new look allows for more cinematic introductions to the bosses, and I personally love these. We need more time to appreciate these guys before we brutally murder them. But it's also a trade-off since we lost the really nice anime cutscenes of before. The bosses themselves do benefit the most from this 3D treatment. Some of them had segmented bodies that were basically required due to hardware limitations. But here all the snake boys and girls have fully articulated bodies. And though I don't want to boil this down to, this is how the original is, and this is how the remake is, so I'm just going to treat this from here on out as its own game, with one very quick diversion. I like the new character designs. Richter isn't very different, but Maria traded in her dress for pantaloons, and I enjoy this look quite a bit, even if it is a departure. This was supposedly done due to it being easier to animate this in 3D, but while it is less of a funny juxtaposition here, it is more appropriate for an aspiring vampire hunter, so I do like the practical look here. Anyway, now to stop comparing these two games side by side. Now this game has to stand up on its own. Mostly. Though even then, some comparisons are inevitable, and the occasional plus or minus will get thrown in as it does come up. Like how Maria's Subdragon weapon no longer covers up the inventory so I can see how much ammo she has. Whoops, there I go again. But from here on out, I'll just act like Nintendo of America in the 90s and pretend the PC engine Rondo of Blood doesn't exist. Except I will ignore this rule because I have a PSP agenda that I need to push. Once we boot up the game, we're greeted with a cinematic opening, retelling the events leading to this, and then there's a prologue level that's basically just here to sell this being a more story-driven affair than the other traditional Castlevanias like 1 and 3. Richter Belmont, our protagonist, isn't magically at a location whipping demons, he has to do a tedious commute. See, now I can relate to him. But once the first level opens up proper, the full glory of this blue-clad vampire hunter becomes apparent. He jumps, he whips, you know, the usual, but double tapping the jump button allows him to do a cool backflip, and as another point in favour of this remake, he can even do that when pressing forward and committing to a forward jump arc. He can cancel out of that on the fly, whereas the PC engine Richter required him to fully stand still, which made this a much less useful utility. This backflip is such a great save, but even if it was useless, it would still be awesome just for how stylish it is. Unlike some of the other previous Belmont adventures, Richter here can jump on and off stairs, which is a godsend for Castlevania fans, since stairs were the main course of death in some of the earlier games. Stairs are so streamlined here as well, but they're more of just a fun alternate route instead of an annoyance that you dread having to go on. The opening stage shows the play of this by making you use stairs a lot before giving you a taste of freedom. While not immediately obvious, there is a split pathway here, with one being obviously intended. Most of the stages have diverging points like this, which change the second half of the level, the boss fight afterwards, and whichever level is next. Basically a default way and an alternative way. Nothing too complicated, but it's appreciated a lot, and makes it a joy to explore and replay, especially since some have obvious clues, or the area they're in just seems very conspicuous. Though some of these are actually harder to see in this overly detailed remake. Depending on your perspective, this is either a pro or a con, but it being easier to see in the original is something I do appreciate, which is a knock against the PSP version, at least for first time players. Though the other kind of pathway is the same either way, and these are the ones I appreciate the most, even if they seem counterintuitive. Fall down a hole because you messed up platforming, and boom, alternate route. Some secrets are hidden down here, So you may purposely jump into, what would be in any other game, a death pit, but here it's something that rewards you. The reason that this is good, even if it does seem like it goes against the rules of a series, is that by default we get a lot fewer death pits, and these were the scourge of the classic Castlevania games. The limited jump and the large knockback meant most of your deaths were from this alone. In fact, they made an entire game based around the concept of knockback. It was called Castlevania Dracula X. Those issues are far less prevalent here due to having more control and less severe knockback, but still, when you do fall in a pit, instead of raising your blood pressure, it just sends you elsewhere. But hey, having two solutions to a problem is better than none. This is even less of an issue with Maria, our second playable character. She's a young vampire slayer in waiting, and one of the 4 maidens kidnapped to fuel this game's plot. The other 3 are just here for plot significance, including Richter's girlfriend, but they all take a backseat to Maria. Simply put, she is this game's easy mode, but in the Funky Kong way of being easy but no less fun to speed on by as. With her, we double jump, shoot doves as projectiles which have a larger area to hurt enemies, and she has both a slide and roll to avoid attacks. In theory, she's here to assist players who have trouble getting through the later levels and bosses, but she's also here to encourage replayers. If playing the same game twice doesn't appeal to you for some reason, do it again but with an entirely different moveset. She can even bypass chunks of the levels so you can feel like a speedrunner. Just don't actually look at real speedruns of this game because they just make you feel inadequate. Maria's sub-weapons are also nothing like Richter's. Instead of the iconic Belmont axes, knives, and biblical paraphernalia, we have a series of animals for her. Cats, turtles, and dragons are here at your disposal, and they are all friends. But regardless of which vampire hunter is roaming these ruins, they both have access to Item Crash, which is such a wonderful addition to this series. Sub-weapons are basically required for some encounters, unless you're like good at the game or something. They're generally here to allow the player to get more damage in, as they're weapons with reach generally exceeding what a Belmont can do, so they can be done from a safe distance. Though there are exceptions to this, like slowing down time as Richter, or getting the chance to block damage as Maria. They all cost ammunition to use, so they should be used sparingly, but if you hoard enough ammo for a super attack, one can be performed. It's basically a souped up version of whatever the base move would be, and these do turn the tide of battle. But they also use so much ammo that it may not be worth it, when you could just fire a lot of smaller attacks. This is a great system that frankly makes the earlier games in this style feel primitive in comparison. Take that complete control of your character in Castlevania 4. You and your fancy playability are no match for me being rewarded for hoarding. And firing sub-weapons and performing item crashes are much easier here, with the full button customization of this PSP release. If for some reason you're like me and you want to map these to the L and R shoulder buttons, you're in luck. With 2 fun characters, improved controls, maneuverability, weapon options, and levels that don't just send you to bottomless pits, it sounds like we have an easy and accessible game here. Well, we don't, it's still classic Castlevania. But for what it's worth, Rondo of Blood was one of the easier ones in the series, and for the most part, this PSP release is even easier than that. Just remember, I said for the most part these are easier, because that's coming up later. Lives aren't that plentiful, and even though the checkpoints themselves are generous, losing all your lives sends you back to the beginning of these sometimes long levels. But without sounding too patronizing, these games reward familiarity and perseverance. So even if they at first feel daunting, eventually they become nothing. Just keep at it. And if that doesn't work, keep at it but with Maria. But all the levels feel challenging at first. Unless you're doing that frog level, of course, that always felt kind of out of place and unfinished. Though the actual out of place and unfinished level, Alternate Stage 5, kinda made me forget about the frog shortcomings. But that's a story for a few minutes from now, not a few seconds. The levels themselves become second nature. Even if you don't know for a fact what's ahead, you can kind of sense when the Castlevania tropes will flow in. The positioning of enemies is just something you can set your watch to. Something else that becomes second nature is the placement of secrets like breakable walls that often lead to food to restore your health, which come in meat variations for Richter or desserts for Maria. Sometimes the secrets lead to collectible CDs in this PSP version, and these are used for the game's music options. Like, sure, we have a sound test, but it doesn't matter. This game goes the extra mile and lets us customize what music appears in which levels. A lot of these CDs are out in the open, however, but locked behind red bone walls. And these are walls you cannot destroy at first. But saving the maidens leads you to getting the ability to destroy red skeletons, which not only means these small obstacles are gone, but we can finally kill a recurring enemy who normally get back up after being defeated. It's a nice change, but doesn't ruin the core gameplay by any means, even if Rondo purists don't want these skeletons to be permanently defeated. But I can't hear their complaints over all these great songs. Some other secrets are way more secret, and these are my favourite. Thank you, Maria, for squeezing into areas that shouldn't be accessible. If you let it, this almost becomes a kind of collectathon, and that's exactly what I like. In fact, to unlock the old games, including the one that takes up half of the back of a box, you have to find them and they're pretty cryptic. But they're represented as heavily compressed versions of the original art for both games. I love it! Now to get back onto that hanging thread I left open a while ago. The original version of Rondo had an alternate stage 5 that was basically a mashup of already existing level themes, and the level design itself wasn't exactly the best. It didn't even have a boss, it was just sort of there. It felt more like an obligation than anything. That was completely rectified here on PSP. Alternate Stage 5 now has an updated layout, new visuals, and a boss. A hard boss, mind you. So instead of showing footage of me suffering against it, here's footage of the game playing itself, because we can actually buy videos of the developers beating these for us, just to show you what it's meant to be like. And while that might sound pointless, and it kind of is, the same shop shows off Maria's secret move. In the future, when the internet doesn't exist but the PSP still does, people will still be able to do the Maria move, so this post-apocalyptic future isn't all bad. This new level does still have elements of the original, like the upper and lower paths that lead back to two different sets of stairs that change the later portion of a level, and this annoying fight is back. I'd call it undeniably an upgrade that doesn't sacrifice the charms of the original, but I won't, because it would lead to angry commenters, so I'll just steer clear of that. The new boss being kinda difficult and out of place was just a precursor to the other new boss fight here. Dracula is the final boss, no surprises here. And while his Rondo of Blood version was a bit too easy all things considered, the devs overcorrected it here. We still have the same first two phases, which are easier than ever, but if you have the prerequisites, there is a special third phase, and I kinda hate it. They dialed up the intensity to 11, when all I wanted it was to be at like a 7 or so. But hey, it's the journey, not the destination that matters. And the journey was near flawless when it comes to everything I want. They even put Suezo from Monster Rancher in the game just for me. But the disappointing destination concludes with a final cutscene and credits, which while nice on their own right, can't compare with the two endings of the original. And it really does cement that in some ways we really did lose something of this depiction of Maria. Mechanically, she's the same, if not better, with the new control options and the UI not being covered, but the joke of her being an out-of-place juxtaposition in this gothic environment really isn't here when it mattered the most, the fun silly ending. But on the other hand, she still plays well and has improvements, so I'll cry a small singular tear since my ending is less humorous. Meanwhile, the rest of me is having the time of my life killing everything efficiently and breaking the game. This remake is such a wonderful release, and while I'd not want to label it definitive, due to there being a few small elements that are lesser, it is still my go-to version. I feel it's slept on too hard just because of its prettier older sister for the PC Engine. As a total package, Dracula X Chronicles for PSP is definitive. We have Rondo of Blood, a remake of Rondo of Blood, and the sequel to Rondo of Blood. So even if 1/3 of this isn't your preferred way, the other 2/3 should do the job. But since the two non-ugly games are often ported elsewhere, this is just me talking into a void. This completely redone interpretation of Rondo of Blood, the backbone of this package, is just a fleeting memory for those lucky enough to have experienced it. And while it's sad it's not played anymore, it at least made a splash once long ago, and it helped keep this style of Castlevania alive in a post-Symphony of the Night era. I ought to play that game sometime, but right now if a side scroller is more complicated than walking to the finish line, it's too much for me.